Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Imagine standing in a dimly lit basement beneath the old administration building where the air feels heavy with the weight of secrecy and sleeplessness. The hum of IBM machines fills the underground air, the scent of ink and sweat blending into something almost metallic. Here, in this suffocating chamber known as Station Hypo, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer fights not against flesh and blood, but against numbers cold, unfeeling groups of 5 digits that might hold the key to the fate of the Pacific. His eyes sting from exhaustion, pupils narrowed against the glare of the desk lamp. For days, no, weeks, he has lived without sunlight, sustained only by benzodrine tablets and grim determination. His pencil trembles as he scribbles one more notation onto the worksheet before him. Around him rise columns of IBM punch cards, towering like silent witnesses to the relentless labor of his team. Each card, every single one, represents hours of methodical thought, sleepless nights, and the unyielding pursuit of meaning hidden within Japanese naval codes. And what those numbers conceal could alter the course of the entire war. Picture the stakes. The Pacific Fleet, battered and diminished, clinging to hope. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 3 floors above, waiting for an answer that could determine whether he would send his last 3 carriers into a trap or into history. The arithmetic of destiny unfolds beneath Dyer's trembling fingers. Every code group, every permutation, every fragment of intercepted transmission might spell victory or ruin. In this subterranean war room, results mattered more than ranks or uniforms. Beside Dyer stood Commander Joseph Rochefort, his figure wrapped not in navy blues, but in a bathrobe and worn slippers. Some would later call it eccentricity. In truth, it was necessity. The basement was stifling, the heat from the machines almost unbearable. Discipline had yielded to practicality long ago. What mattered was not how they looked, but whether they could uncover the truth before it was too late. Neither man knew that within a week their discoveries would change the direction of World War II. The latest intercepts had revealed something ominous. The Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing its largest operation since Pearl Harbor. 4 aircraft carriers, escorted by dozens of warships and manned by the world's most seasoned aviators, were converging toward an unknown target marked only by 2 cryptic letters, AF. What was AF? That was the riddle tormenting every man in Station Hypo. Get it right, and the United States might seize its first great victory in the Pacific. Get it wrong, and the ocean would swallow the last hope of resistance. Japan had 10 fleet carriers. America had 3, and one of them, Yorktown, still limped from wounds, suffered in the Battle of the Coral Sea. One wrong assumption, one false interpretation of those icy strings of numbers, and Admiral Nimitz could lose everything: ships, men, the Pacific itself. To understand how much hung in the balance, you must step back 6 months to the morning when the course of history first shifted. December 7th, 1941. A radiant, peaceful dawn over the Hawaiian Islands. Families dressed for church. Sailors aboard the proud battleships of the Pacific Fleet sipped coffee or lingered over breakfast. It was a Sunday morning that should have passed in quiet routine. Then, at 7:55 a.m., the sky itself turned hostile. Peace shattered. 353 Japanese aircraft screamed down in 2 crushing waves, each strike executed with ruthless precision. Above the chaos, stood the mind of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategist who saw what others could not, that Japan held only a fleeting advantage, a spark of power that must be used before America's vast industry could awaken. His mission was brutally destroy the Pacific Fleet before the sleeping giant could rise, and as bombs fell and battleships burned, that mission began its terrible fulfillment. Give Japan 6 months. That was the plan, 6 months to a year, for the empire to tighten its grip on its vast new conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then force peace from a position of unassailable power. But within 2 hours on that bright December morning, that dream was baptized in fire and oil. 8 American battleships lay shattered, broken hulks amid a burning harbor. The USS Arizona vanished in a single apocalyptic instant when an 1,800-pound armor-piercing bomb pierced her forward magazine. The explosion was so violent it lifted the 30,000-ton ship out of the water before tearing her apart. Over 100 men died in that moment, entombed forever within the steel tomb that still rests beneath the waters of Pearl Harbor. Across the harbor, the USS Oklahoma capsized after torpedoes ripped open her port side. 429 sailors and Marines were trapped inside. Some clung to life for days in tiny air pockets, their desperate hammering echoing from within the hull as rescue crews, frantic but helpless, tried to reach them. The USS West Virginia sank to the harbor floor, taking 106 men with her, yet she would rise again, raised, repaired, and return to battle in the Pacific. On that Sunday morning, however, she was merely one more symbol of American vulnerability. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 180 aircraft had been obliterated on the ground. Hangars, maintenance bays, and workshops lay in ruins. 203 Americans were dead, 2,008 Navy, 109 Marines, 218 Army personnel, and 68 civilians, with another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, the supposed shield against Japan's expansion, lay crippled and bleeding. In his headquarters, Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, stood at the window watching his command burn. A spent bullet cracked the glass beside him, showering him with fragments. He bent, picked up the twisted piece of lead, and stared at it for a long moment before murmuring to an aide that it might have been kinder if it had killed him outright. Kimmel knew the truth. His career had ended in flames. Within days, he would be relieved of command, replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz. His request for a court-martial, his plea to clear his name, would be denied. The shadow of Pearl Harbor would follow him for the rest of his life. And yet, for all its devastation, the Japanese assault had missed its most vital targets. All 3 of America's Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning. The Enterprise was returning from Wake Island, delayed by a weather front that, in retrospect, seemed providential. The Lexington was en route to Midway ferrying aircraft. The Saratoga was in dry dock on the U.S. West Coast for maintenance. Those 3 ship survivors by chance would soon become the backbone of a new kind of naval warfare. Few realized it then, but the age of the battleship had ended that morning. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, to the men who launched war from their decks rather than from heavy guns. America, by luck and Japanese miscalculation, still had its carriers. The Japanese also spared the oil storage tanks, the dry docks, the submarine base, and the repair facilities targets they deemed unimportant once the fleet was destroyed. It was a catastrophic oversight. Those very installations would soon make Pearl Harbor the heart of America's counterattack across the Pacific. The submarine stationed there would devastate Japanese merchant shipping. The repair yards would resurrect ships the Japanese thought lost forever. Within months, the harbor, once synonymous with defeat, would become a bustling forge of vengeance and renewal. Down in that same underground labyrinth, Commander Joseph Rochefort faced an impossible challenge. His domain, Station Hypo, the Navy's Secret Signals Intelligence Unit, had been intercepting Japanese communications for years, but success was limited. Officially known as Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, its nickname came from the phonetic code for the letter H, Hypo, for Hawaii. Before the attack, they could read only fragments 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, rarely enough to piece together the full picture. The enemy's main operational code, labeled JN-25 by American cryptanalysts, was a masterpiece of cryptographic design. 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit code groups, each one representing a word or phrase. To make the system nearly unbreakable, the Japanese encrypted it twice. First, they encoded a message using their secret code book. Then, to mask patterns, they added random five-digit numbers drawn from special additive tables, a process known as super-encipherment. For the Americans, decoding such a message was like peeling layers from an onion made of steel. They had to strip away the additives mathematically, then deduce what each five-digit code group actually meant, based on patterns seen across thousands of intercepted messages. The additive books themselves contained 300 pages, each with 100 random five-digit numbers. To send a message, a Japanese operator would start on a specified page and line, adding each number to the corresponding code group. The recipient, knowing the same starting point, would subtract those same numbers to recover the original message. But for Rochefort's team, discovering which additive table had been used and where in it the message began was the first brutal puzzle. Sometimes clues came from call signs or indicators. Often they had to test hundreds of possibilities. Then came December 1st, 1941, 6 days before the attack. The Japanese switched to a new version of JN-25, dubbed JN-25B. In an instant, all the progress Station Hypo had made disintegrated. Every known code group, every painstaking breakthrough, every analytical shortcut. They all became worthless overnight. The cryptanalysts were forced back to square one, facing what looked like endless strings of random numbers. Yet Rochefort felt that something was coming. Even without reading the messages themselves, his analysts had noticed a surge in radio activity, shifts in call signs, and unusual traffic volumes. The pattern screamed preparation. The sea lanes whispered movement. But the Japanese strike force bound for Pearl Harbor maintained absolute radio silence for 11 days as 6 carriers and their escorts cut through the North Pacific from Hitokapu Bay in the Kurale Islands. They transmitted nothing, not a single signal, to betray their presence. How do you track an armada that leaves no trace? It was, without question, the most devastating intelligence failure in American history. The clues had been there, fragmented, incomplete, and tragically misinterpreted. Some warnings reached Washington through decrypted diplomatic traffic from a separate system called Purple, which revealed growing tension but no operational details. When the attack came, it struck like thunder from a clear sky. Rochefort understood that mourning failure would achieve nothing. The only way forward, the only path to redemption lay through the very language of the enemy. To win the next battle, they would have to listen harder, think deeper, and break the code that had blinded them before. If Station Hypo could unlock JN-25B, if its weary cryptanalysts could finally read enough Japanese naval traffic to grasp the shape of the enemy's intentions, then perhaps, just perhaps, Pearl Harbor would never happen again. perhaps intelligence, not firepower, could hand Admiral Nimitz the single weapon capable of redressing Japan's overwhelming advantage, foreknowledge. And at the center of this desperate effort stood a man no one would have expected, Joseph John Rochefort. Born in Dayton, Ohio on May 12, 1900, Rochefort joined the Navy in 1918, still a boy of 17. He shaved 2 years off his age, claiming to have been born in 1898, a small deception that followed him throughout his naval record. Fresh out of the Navy's steam engineering school at the Stevens Institute of Technology, he received his commission as an ensign on June 14, 1919. Nothing in those early years hinted at the extraordinary role he would one day play, but someone saw what others missed. Rochefort had an odd gift for puzzles. He devoured crossword grids, dissected logic problems, and mastered auction bridge, a card game that rewarded intuition, memory, and the ability to see invisible patterns. To most, those were mere hobbies. To one perceptive officer, they were the hallmarks of a cryptanalyst's mind, a mind that could see order in chaos. That observation changed everything. Rochefort was sent into the Navy's tiny, obscure cryptanalysis program, a handful of men working in cramped rooms with almost no resources, laboring to penetrate the secret messages of potential enemies. From the start, he excelled. But what set him apart wasn't just mathematical dexterity. It was empathy and insight. In the mid-1920s, the Navy dispatched him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural immersion. From 1929 to 1932, Rochefort lived in Tokyo, studying the language at the Navy's school while absorbing far more than grammar and syntax. He learned how the Japanese thought, how they structured hierarchy and duty, how they balanced discipline with honor. He understood that beneath every Japanese military order ran a current of cultural nuance invisible to outsiders. That understanding melding linguistics, psychology, and logic would later make him uniquely equipped to lead Station Hypo when war erupted. His deputy, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, was cut from different cloth, but no less formidable. A Naval Academy graduate and protege of the legendary cryptanalyst Agnes Miss Aggie Driscoll, Dyer possessed an uncanny facility for recognizing numerical patterns. Driscoll herself was a pioneer, a brilliant code breaker since the days of World War I, and the first to realize that IBM punch card machines could be repurposed as weapons of code breaking. Her vision had reshaped naval intelligence, and Dyer, her student, carried that vision into the Pacific. Dyer had served at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. His colleagues spoke of his photographic recall of code groups and his eerie ability to intuit missing words from fragments of encrypted text. During the fevered months before Midway, he often worked for days without sleep, sustained by benzodrine tablets. "There were men getting shot at out there," he would later say dryly. "If this stuff hurt me later, so what?" The cryptanalytics section around him seemed more madhouse than military office. A hand-lettered sign on Dyer's desk read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." And indeed, it helped. In the stifling basement of Station Hypo, formality had long since surrendered to function. The IBM machines roared and radiated heat. Uniforms became unbearable. Officers and enlisted men alike worked in bathrobes and slippers. Rank blurred into irrelevance. What mattered was clarity of thought, sharpness of perception, and the courage to question everything. Rochefort encouraged that culture deliberately. "We can accomplish anything," he often said, "provided no one cares who gets the credit." In a Navy obsessed with hierarchy, that attitude was revolutionary. Junior officers were free expected to challenge superiors. Radiomen, linguists, mathematicians, all voices mattered. One sharp-eyed technician might notice a recurring pattern that a senior officer had missed. A translator's cultural insight might unlock the meaning behind a cryptic word. This was how breakthroughs happened, not through rank or protocol, but through collaboration. Among those collaborators was Marine Captain Alva Laswell, head of the linguistics section. Like Rochefort, he had studied in Tokyo for 3 years and spoke Japanese with fluency and nuance. During the Midway campaign, Laswell would be promoted to major, though. Out of habit and humility, he continued to answer to his old rank. His team of 5 linguists represented the finest Japanese language specialists in the Navy. Their job was to translate fragments of messages once the cryptanalysts had stripped away the additive encryption, and to interpret those fragments in context. A message mentioning carriers, aircraft, and fuel might be routine, or it might foretell an impending strike. The linguist's understanding of tone, idiom, and military phrasing often meant the difference between insight and disaster. Meanwhile, the traffic analysis section led by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams fought its own invisible battle. They didn't need to read messages to learn from them. By charting which stations transmitted to which, monitoring message volume and priority, and mapping how communication patterns shifted, they could deduce Japanese operations even when the content was locked away. If carrier divisions suddenly went silent, it could mean only one thing: they were at sea. Together, these groups formed the beating heart of Station Hypo. A few dozen men and women working in an airless bunker, surrounded by the rhythmic chatter of typewriters and the thrum of machines. Their days blurred into nights, their efforts punctuated by fatigue and fleeting flashes of revelation. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of seemingly meaningless 5-digit numbers, caught by radio operators stationed from Hawaii to Australia. Those intercepts flowed into Hypo for analysis. The cryptanalysts' first task was to strip away the additive encryption, a process as tedious as it was precise. The Japanese system used non-carrying addition if a code group was 1012-345 and the additive was 67890. The result became 79135. To reverse it, analysts had to identify which additive table had been used, then subtract accordingly. That could take hours for a single message. Only after the additives were stripped away could they confront the second challenge, determining what each remaining code group meant. For that, they relied on immense card catalogs, the product of years of accumulated knowledge, thousands upon thousands of IBM punch cards, each one representing a fragment of understanding. Imagine it, an underground labyrinth of paper, heat, and noise, where every number was a clue and every clue might save a fleet. There, in the depths of Station Hypo, Rochefort's eccentric, exhausted, brilliant team waged a quiet war of intellect against time, against secrecy, and against the shadow of another Pearl Harbor. They were chasing ghosts made of numbers. Each message was a puzzle without a picture, on the box-only fragments, patterns, and intuition to guide them. The men and women of Station Hypo built meaning the way an archaeologist rebuilds a shattered vase one piece at a time, comparing shards, noting repetitions, slowly revealing form from chaos. When a particular 5-digit group appeared often in messages between carrier divisions, they reasoned it might mean aircraft, aviation fuel, or flight operations. If it cropped up in logistics reports, perhaps it meant supplies or ammunition. The IBM punch card machines could shuffle and sort through thousands of intercepts, searching for recurring combinations, but it was human insight that transformed data into intelligence. The machines were tools. The analysts were artists. They searched for rhythm in randomness. They debated, argued, guessed, and sometimes those guesses were brilliant. Code-breaking was not mechanical labor, it was detective work of the highest order, demanding the precision of a mathematician, the intuition of a linguist, the imagination of a poet. By March 1942, their relentless work began to pay off. Station Hypo could now read enough of JN-25B to extract fragments of valuable intelligence. The breakthrough hadn't come in a flash of revelation, but through months of endurance and incremental progress. Each recovered code group made the next message easier to read. Each uncovered additive pattern made the next decryption faster. Gradually, the once impenetrable fog of Japanese communications began to thin. Their growing skill bore fruit in early May during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Hypo's partial decrypts helped the U.S. Navy locate Japanese carriers and prepare for an engagement that halted Japan's southward drive toward Australia. It was a turning point, not an outright victory, but the first time Japan had been stopped. And for the first time in history, two fleets fought a naval battle without ever seeing each other. Airplanes, not guns, were the new arbiters of sea power. The Japanese lost two carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, to damage and attrition, forcing them out of the next major operation. Yet, for all their success, Rochefort's analysts were still only glimpsing fragments of the enemy's plans. At best, they could read 30 to 40% of any given message. Many remained opaque, lost in layers of encryption and Japanese ingenuity. The enemy constantly rotated codebooks and additive tables, forcing Hypo to begin again and again from scratch. The pressure was merciless. Every hour mattered. Every intercepted message might conceal information that could save or cost thousands of lives. Each decision was shadowed by the ghosts of Pearl Harbor. Then, in mid-May, the storm signs appeared. The volume of Japanese naval traffic surged. Messages crackled between combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, battleship squadrons, submarine groups, and invasion forces. Even when unreadable, their sheer frequency revealed something monumental. Japan was preparing for a major operation, one scheduled for early June. The question was, where? Each intercepted message referred to a target known only by two letters, AF. Rochefort's team studied the context and saw the outline taking shape. Every clue pointed toward Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Picture it. Two small islands, sand and eastern, barely 2 miles across, encircled by a brilliant turquoise reef. But its position made it priceless. If Japan took Midway, they could threaten Hawaii itself and choke off American communications across the Central Pacific. More than that, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto wanted to draw out and destroy the remaining U.S. carriers. He understood industrial reality. Japan could never win a long war. Its window of advantage was closing, and it had to win utterly in 1942. Midway, he believed, would be the decisive blow. Yet not everyone agreed with Rochefort's conclusion. In Washington, D.C., the Navy's official cryptanalysis center, OP-20G, was unconvinced. On paper, it was the superior institution. More personnel, more equipment, more prestige. But its analysts, focused on broad global intelligence, lacked Hypo's intimacy with Japanese naval traffic and the Pacific theater. The Washington experts proposed other theories. Perhaps AF referred to the Aleutian Islands. Others thought it might be Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. Some even warned of another strike against Hawaii or the American West Coast. Without certainty, Admiral Nimitz faced an impossible dilemma. If he placed his carriers at Midway and the Japanese struck elsewhere, he would lose both his fleet and the true target. Yet, if he guessed wrong the other way, Hawaii itself could fall. The debate grew fierce. Bureaucratic lines hardened. In Washington, OP-20G had recently been reorganized. Its brilliant founder, Commander Lawrence Safford, known as the father of U.S. Navy cryptology, had been replaced by Commander John Redmond, a competent communications officer, but no cryptanalyst. Redmond valued order, hierarchy, and procedure. To him, analysis was something to be controlled, not questioned. To Rochefort, this was madness. He reported directly to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, and an old friend from his Tokyo language school days. The two spoke the same professional and cultural language, literally and figuratively. Intelligence flowed quickly and directly from basement to bridge, bypassing the labyrinth of Washington bureaucracy. That efficiency enraged the capital. From their perspective, Rochefort was insubordinate, circumventing channels, ignoring oversight, threatening the centralized control of naval intelligence. From his perspective, war did not wait for paperwork. But at the top of the Navy stood Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. Brilliant, temperamental, and uncompromising, King demanded strict adherence to chain of command. He trusted his staff in Washington far more than an eccentric codebreaker in a Hawaiian basement. The stage was set not only for a confrontation between fleets, but between two worlds, the rigid machinery of bureaucracy in Washington and the fevered, instinctive genius of the men in Station Hypo. One side had authority, the other had insight. Only time and battle would reveal which mattered more. The tension in late May 1942 had reached the breaking point, not only across the Pacific, but within the U.S. Navy itself. Admiral Ernest King, in Washington, a man of volcanic temper and iron discipline, distrusted Joseph Rochefort. He saw the Station Hypo chief as arrogant, defiant, too willing to gamble on partial information. To King and to Commander John Redmond, who now led the Navy's code-breaking organization, OP-20G intelligence was something to be managed, controlled, and verified through proper channels. Rochefort's habit of sending raw decrypts and bold interpretations directly to Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii was, in their eyes, insubordination masquerading as brilliance. But to Rochefort and his exhausted team in the steaming basement beneath the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, this was not about bureaucratic turf. It was about survival. If they were wrong, if AF did not mean Midway, America's remaining carriers would be sailing into an ambush that could end the war in the Pacific in a single day, the ruse that changed the war. It was Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, a submariner turned intelligence officer, who proposed the idea that would settle the question once and for all. Holmes, pragmatic and sharp, knew the Japanese were monitoring American communications, just as the Americans monitored theirs. His plan was simple. Let Midway send an uncoded message that they're short on fresh water, he said. If the Japanese report that AF is short of water, we'll know for certain. It was audacious, almost too simple. Yet its simplicity was what made it believable. Tropical islands did suffer desalination failures. Water shortages were a routine nuisance. The Japanese would never suspect it was a trap. Rochefort immediately endorsed the plan and carried it to Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer. Nimitz himself approved it without hesitation. Orders were sent via undersea cable, a secure line the Japanese could not intercept, directing Midway's garrison to transmit an unencrypted radio message reporting a water crisis. Around May 1921, 1942, Midway dutifully sent the signal, "Desalination plant out of action. Need fresh water urgently." 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message encrypted in JN-25 that reported, "AF is short of water." It was the confirmation Rochefort needed. AF was indeed Midway. The Japanese were coming. The date-time breakthrough. But knowing where was only half the battle. The Navy also needed to know when. Here, another of Hypo's officers, Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, achieved a breakthrough almost as crucial as Holmes's deception. Working under Thomas Dyer's direction, Finnegan discovered how the Japanese super-encrypted their date-time groups in additional cipher system layered atop JN-25. Cracking it required complex mathematical analysis and an intuitive grasp of how Japanese clerks formatted operational orders. Once Finnegan solved it, Station Hypo could read time indicators within the messages. On May 26th, they intercepted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting transports. When decrypted using Finnegan's method, the data revealed a precise timetable. The Japanese attack would fall on June 4th or 5th, 1942. This was unprecedented. No commander in history had possessed such detailed, near real-time intelligence about an enemy fleet before it sailed into battle. Washington versus Hawaii. Yet Washington still balked. OP-20G dismissed Hypo's conclusions as overconfident interpretation. They believed the attack would occur in mid-June, not early June. To Admiral King and Commander Redmond, Rochefort's certainty bordered on recklessness. They warned that basing major fleet movements on partial decrypts could lead to disaster. But Rochefort refused to bend. His team had worked for weeks on 18 to 24-hour shifts, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower. The evidence was overwhelming traffic analysis, logistical preparations, unit designations, Finnegan's date-time decrypts, and the water shortage confirmation all converged on one answer. Midway, early June. 4 carriers. If he was wrong, it would end his career and cost thousands of lives. If he was right, it could change the course of the war. Rochefort staked everything on his conclusion. We know where, we know when. By May 27th, Station Hypo had decrypted enough to present Admiral Chester Nimitz with an extraordinary report. Rochefort and Leighton briefed the Pacific Fleet staff inside the underground war room at Pearl Harbor. The room was tense, filled with officers who found it hard to believe that codebreakers could know so much about the enemy's plans. Rochefort, in his worn bathrobe and slippers, stood before them, calm and confident. One by one, he laid out the evidence message intercepts, decrypted code groups, traffic patterns, dates, ship identifications. The Japanese strike force, he said, would consist of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same that had attacked Pearl Harbor, 2 battleships, including Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers. About 250 carrier aircraft, flown by elite veterans. An invasion force of roughly 5,000 troops set to land on Midway by June 7th. No Navy in history had ever gone into battle with such detailed foreknowledge of its enemy's composition, course, and schedule. Nimitz now knew where, when, and what was coming. In some respects, he understood Yamamoto's plan better than Yamamoto's own subordinates. The miracle of the Yorktown. But intelligence alone would not win the battle. The United States had only 3 carriers left in the Pacific Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown was crippled. She had been battered at Coral Sea, her flight deck torn open, her hangars scorched, fuel lines shattered. Estimates called for 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound. Nimitz didn't have 3 months. He didn't even have 3 weeks. He told the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, "You have 72 hours." On May 28th, Yorktown entered dry dock number 1. Over 400 workers swarmed her decks in 3 continuous shifts, welding, patching, splicing, improvising. The air rang with the sound of hammers and torches through day and night. Repairs that should have taken 90 days were done in 72 hours. Some fixes were temporary, held together with steel plates and faith, but they would last long enough. At dawn on May 30th, with welders still aboard finishing their work, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. She wasn't whole, but she could fight. 3 carriers against 4, 3 days' repairs against months of preparation. In the balance hung the fate of the Pacific, and far below the calm surface of that ocean, in the suffocating basement of Station Hypo, Rochefort's men kept working, listening, decrypting, watching the invisible signals that would soon decide whether their gamble had been justified or fatal. Imagine the ocean stretching endlessly before you, a silver-blue expanse shimmering beneath the morning sun. Now picture 4 Japanese carriers cutting through those waters like predators, their decks alive with activity, their crews certain of victory. They had trained together for years, perfecting the art of coordinated destruction. Their movements were rehearsed, their timing flawless. Since the war's beginning, their carriers had struck as one, swift, precise, unstoppable. Across that same ocean, 3 American carriers waited, silent and unseen. Their pilots were brave but untested, their doctrine still forming, their confidence tempered by inexperience. Many had never seen battle. Some had only just mastered the precarious dance of landing on a moving deck. Against Japan's elite aviators, men hardened by years of war in China and the Pacific, the imbalance seemed almost insurmountable. The numbers, the skill, the experience, all favored Japan. And yet, Nimitz held a secret weapon more powerful than any bomb or torpedo, knowledge. The invisible edge granted by Rochefort's codebreakers, perfect intelligence. Guided by their deciphered messages, Nimitz positioned his carriers at a point on the map called Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway. It was a name chosen with ironic precision, because luck would have little to do with what followed. There, hidden by distance and the vastness of the sea, they would spring their trap. Meanwhile, the Japanese, confident in their supposed invisibility, steamed toward Midway believing surprise was theirs. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the strike force, expected an easy conquest, a swift morning assault to crush Midway's defenses, followed by a leisurely afternoon hunt for any stray American ships. His intelligence told him Yorktown had sunk in the Coral Sea. Enterprise and Hornet were far away. There could be no American carriers here. But, as with all great gambles, one side was about to discover just how wrong they could be. If Rochefort's analysis had been mistaken, if the location, timing, or even the interpretation of AF were wrong, Nimitz would lose everything. 3 carriers, the Pacific Fleet, Hawaii itself, the war. But if Rochefort was right, if his exhausted, coffee-fueled team in the basement of Station Hypo had read the enemy's mind correctly, then the U.S. Navy was about to strike the first fatal blow of the Pacific War. And so, on June 3, 1942, as the sun rose over the endless Pacific, American patrol planes began to report sightings. First the invasion transports, then, unmistakably, the Japanese carriers themselves. Every coordinate matched Rochefort's predictions. Every movement aligned with the decrypts. The trap was closing. At dawn on June 4th, the Japanese launched their opening strike, 108 aircraft thundering off their decks, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Agile Zeros racing toward Midway. Radar operators on the island detected them 93 miles out. Alarms blared. The defenders scrambled every plane they had. Over the lagoon and the coral reefs, Marine pilots in their outdated F-2A Buffaloes rose to meet the enemy. The sky became a storm of fire and smoke. Bombs fell on fuel tanks and hangars. Flames licked across the runways. Midway burned, but it did not fall. The runways still held, and American aircraft still fought. The Japanese commander surveying the damage coolly reported, "A second strike will be necessary." Then came the first tremor of uncertainty. American bombers from Midway struck back. Marine dive bombers, Army B-17s, and Navy torpedo planes. They hit nothing, but they forced the Japanese fleet to maneuver, to defend, to delay. Their bravery kept Nagumo's air patrols in constant motion, and in war, every minute of hesitation can shift destiny. As Nagumo's aircraft returned, low on fuel, he ordered the reserve planes below deck to be rearmed for a second land strike. The ordnance crews began swapping torpedoes for high-explosive bombs, until, at 7:28 a.m., a single late scout plane crackled a message over the radio. 10 American ships sighted to the northeast. The report hit Nagumo like a thunderclap. American ships? Here? Impossible! His entire understanding of the battle collapsed in that instant. He halted the rearming and ordered the crews to switch back to anti-ship weapons. Below decks, chaos erupted. Bombs half-mounted were removed. Torpedoes rolled across decks slick with aviation fuel. Fumes filled the air. The hangars became death traps waiting for a spark, and then the spark came. At 10:22 a.m., the sky split open as American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared high above. 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntlesses, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had lost contact with their escorts and torpedo bombers, running dangerously low on fuel. McCluskey gambled everything, following the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, and that gamble led him straight to Nagumo's carriers. Below him, the Japanese fleet was at its most vulnerable moment. Decks crowded with fully fueled aircraft, bombs and torpedoes scattered like seeds of destruction, fighters drawn low after annihilating the brave but doomed torpedo squadrons. Those torpedo pilots, 41 men flying into certain death, had bought the moment that changed the war. From 14,000 feet, the Dauntlesses dove. Silent at first, then screaming, engines howling like descending thunder. Bombs fell true. In 6 breathtaking minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryo, were engulfed in flames. On Akagi, a single bomb punched through the flight deck and detonated among the fueled aircraft below. Secondary explosions tore through the hangar. Fire raced across spilled gasoline. In moments, she was a burning inferno, the pride of Japan consumed by her own power. And as the smoke rose into the Pacific sky, the course of the entire war began to shift. Picture the Pacific horizon that June afternoon, smoke rising in black columns, the sea littered with wreckage, and the sound of distant explosions echoing across the waves. On what had once been the proud flagship of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Nagumo stood amid the chaos, forced to abandon his ship as fire devoured the decks and ammunition roared in the infernos below. The once mighty Akagi, symbol of Japanese naval power, was doomed. Nearby, the carrier Kaga was struck by 4 bombs in quick succession. One blast hurled her forward elevator skyward, another tore through the bridge. Flames raced through every passageway, turning the steel hull into an oven. Explosions rippled from bow to stern as her fuel ignited. Her captain gave the order to abandon ship, and then chose to stay, going down with his command in a final act of devotion and despair. The Soryu was next. 3 bombs struck in the space of seconds, tearing open her flight deck, setting her hangars ablaze. Her crew fought valiantly, dragging hoses across burning steel, but the heat was unbearable, the flames unstoppable. After 20 desperate minutes, her captain ordered the evacuation and, like his comrades, refused to leave. Soryu sank 7 hours later, carrying 701 souls into the depths of the Pacific. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded, their decks engulfed, their sailors diving into oil-slicked seas, their nation's naval supremacy dissolving before their eyes. Japanese damage control, designed to fight fires rather than flood compartments, could not contain the inferno. It was over before many even understood what had happened. Only Hiryu, the 4th carrier, escaped the initial catastrophe. She counterattacked with astonishing ferocity, launching waves of bombers that struck the Yorktown, crippling her with torpedoes and bombs until she lay dead in the water. But vengeance was brief. That afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and turned her, too, into a floating torch. By the evening of June 4, 1942, all 4 of Japan's frontline carriers were sinking or abandoned. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators were dead, including the very men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, and ruled the Pacific with unchallenged mastery. They were irreplaceable. Japan's finest were gone, and with them, the empire's offensive power. The United States paid its own price. The Yorktown, hero of Coral Sea and Midway alike, succumbed 2 days later after a Japanese submarine, I-100 Sky 8, slipped through the American screen and fired torpedoes into her hull. The destroyer Hyman, assisting with repairs, was also sunk. The sea closed over Yorktown on June 7th, taking 362 American lives in total. But in the span of 6 minutes of precision and courage, 6 minutes that shattered an empire, the war in the Pacific had changed forever. Japan, which had entered the conflict with 6 fleet carriers, now had only 2 left. Her shipyards could not rebuild what the flames had consumed. The United States, by contrast, was awakening its industrial giant. New Essex-class carriers were already rising from American shipyards, bigger, stronger, more advanced. From that day forward, Japan would never again seize the initiative. Every battle after Midway would be fought on the defensive, a slow and desperate attempt to hold what had already been taken. The unstoppable machinery of American industry, that cold arithmetic of steel and manpower, would grind Japan down, island by island, until the war's bitter end. And to think, it all began in a cramped, overheated basement in Hawaii, with 5-digit numbers punched into paper cards. The timing of the dive bomber assault, arriving at the exact moment the Japanese were most vulnerable, seemed like divine providence. Yet it was the product of something far more human, understanding. Rochefort's men had learned to think like their enemy, to predict their movements through the patterns of code. Their work had rewritten the fate of nations. But victory did not bring them glory. Instead, it ignited a bureaucratic war that raged long after the smoke cleared from Midway. The rivalry between Station Hypo in Hawaii and OP-20G in Washington flared hotter than ever. Both claimed credit for the triumph. Washington analysts insisted their centralized coordination had guided the success. Rochefort's team knew better, but truth, in wartime, often loses to politics. Commander John Redmond, head of OP-20G, detested Rochefort's independence and his direct access to Admiral Nimitz. His brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redmond, a powerful figure in naval communications, backed him completely. Together, they lobbied to strip Hypo of authority, arguing that all cryptanalysis must be controlled from Washington. They had a formidable ally, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, a man who valued discipline and centralization above all else. In October 1942, barely 4 months after the triumph at Midway, Rochefort was quietly relieved of his command. His new assignment? The captain of a floating dry dock in San Francisco, a humiliating exile disguised as necessary sea duty. Everyone understood the truth. It was punishment for defiance, for genius that refused to bow to hierarchy. Nimitz was furious but powerless. King's authority extended over the entire Navy, Nimitz's over only the Pacific. When the two clashed, Washington prevailed. Nimitz's recommendation that Rochefort receive the Distinguished Service Medal was rejected by King's office. Rochefort never returned to the world of cryptanalysis. He served out his remaining years in administrative and maintenance commands, a man whose brilliance had won the most decisive battle of the Pacific, yet who was banished for daring to be right. He never achieved the admiral's rank he deserved. When he retired in 1953, it was quietly, without honors, the war hero the world had almost forgotten. Yet the legacy of his work endured. Station Hypo, under new leadership, continued to crack Japanese communications. The intelligence they produced guided American forces through Guadalcanal, through the island-hopping campaigns, through every bitter step toward Japan's heart. Time and again, decrypted messages revealed the enemy's movements, exposed weaknesses, and gave U.S. commanders the edge they needed to prevail. Every success traced its lineage back to that basement in Hawaii, to Rochefort, to Finnegan, to Layton, to the sleepless codebreakers who changed the tide of history not with guns, but with logic, courage, and belief. The Battle of Midway was not merely a victory of ships and planes, it was the triumph of intellect over arrogance, of insight over firepower, of a handful of men who had the audacity to read the future one code group at a time. Imagine it, April 1943, the jungles of Bougainville swaying beneath a brilliant Pacific sun, and in the sky above, the architect of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, is flying to inspect his frontline troops. He believes himself safe, his schedule known only to the Imperial Navy. But far away, in a cramped, airless room at Pearl Harbor, the men of Station Hypo have already read his fate. From intercepted Japanese messages, they had decrypted every detail of his itinerary, departure time, route, and exact arrival. The intelligence climbed the chain of command all the way to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who gave the quiet order, "Get Yamamoto." On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters lifted off from Guadalcanal, flying a precise, dangerous route guided by that decrypted message. Right on schedule, they intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville. The American fighters dove, fired, and in seconds the mastermind of Pearl Harbor was dead, his plane torn apart, his body later found among the jungle trees. Japan had lost its greatest naval strategist. Its morale plummeted, and once again, the invisible hands at Station Hypo had reached across the Pacific and altered the course of history. Thomas Dyer, the quiet, methodical man who had supervised the JN-25 breakthroughs, remained at Station Hypo throughout the war, eventually rising to captain. Within cryptologic circles, he would be remembered as the father of machine cryptanalysis. After the war, he became one of the 3 principal trainers for the Armed Forces Security Agency, and later the National Security Agency, alongside William Friedman and Lambros Kalimajos. His mastery of IBM punch card analysis, laid the foundation for modern signals intelligence. Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's brilliant intelligence officer, the man who had stood beside Rochefort, championing his analysis at Midway, retired as a rear admiral after a distinguished career. For decades he worked tirelessly to correct the injustice done to his friend. His 1985 memoir, And I Was There, became both an historical account and a moral reckoning, documenting in unflinching detail how Rochefort's genius had been punished instead of praised. Joseph Finnegan, the cryptanalyst who had cracked the Japanese date-time cipher, continued his intelligence career, becoming a leading figure in the post-war signals community. His discovery had been vital. Without it, Nimitz would not have known when to position his carriers. A few days' miscalculation could have turned victory into catastrophe. The linguists, analysts, and mathematicians who had once labored in that sweltering Pearl Harbor basement went their separate ways after the war. Many took their secrets to their graves. For more than 30 years, their accomplishments remained hidden behind layers of classification. Families never knew the truth. Neighbors wondered why these men had spent the war in Hawaii instead of fighting overseas. The cryptanalysts bore their silence as another kind of service, unseen, unacknowledged, but essential. Only in the 1970s did the truth begin to emerge. As the National Security Agency declassified long-buried wartime files, historians finally saw the magnitude of the American success. They learned how completely Japanese communications had been penetrated, how decisions at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal had all rested on the painstaking work of men who fought with paper, pencils, and intuition instead of guns. By 1980, a movement began to right an old wrong. Leading it was Admiral Donald Max Showers, a wartime naval intelligence officer turned CIA veteran, joined by Navy Secretary John Lehman, who recognized both the injustice and the historic weight of Rochefort's work. As newly released documents illuminated Hypo's achievements, the campaign gained unstoppable momentum. And on May 30th, 1986, 44 years after Midway, President Ronald Reagan stood before Rochefort's family and posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal. Rochefort had died a decade earlier, in July 1976, never knowing that vindication would finally come. His children accepted the medal on his behalf at the White House. The citation praised his sustained superior performance and noted that his intelligence work contributed in large measure to the victory of United States forces at Midway. It was a modest description for what had truly been the most important intelligence triumph in American military history. The story of Joseph Rochefort is not merely about code breaking. It is about vision, integrity, and moral courage. He succeeded because he united skills rarely found in one person: the mathematician's precision, the linguist's nuance, the cultural scholar's empathy, and the leader's humility. He understood Japan not as an abstraction, but as a living system of thought and behavior. He also understood people. Within the dim, humid confines of Station Hypo, he built a culture of collaboration, one where rank mattered less than insight, where a junior officer's intuition could change the direction of analysis. He gave his team freedom to think, to challenge assumptions, to follow patterns wherever they led. When Washington doubted him, Rochefort held his ground, placing truth above politics, accuracy above ambition. Thomas Dyer's relentless dedication, working 20-hour shifts with pharmaceutical stimulants to stay awake. Finnegan's flashes of mathematical brilliance, the linguists who traced Japanese idioms through endless intercepts. Together, they proved that impossible problems yield to teamwork, creativity, and endurance. They knew that every minute mattered. Somewhere in the Pacific, men would live or die depending on the next decrypt. The legacy of their work extended far beyond Midway. Rochefort's success demonstrated that signals intelligence could shape the destiny of wars. It showed that patient investment in cryptanalysis, even when results seemed unattainable, could produce decisive advantage. It proved that when commanders trusted their intelligence officers and acted with courage upon information that defied conventional wisdom, history itself could be rewritten. The ripples of that transformation reached far into the future. Japan's defeat ushered in a democratic era, transforming a former adversary into one of America's closest allies. The Pacific Islands, once battlefields, became strategic bulwarks of the Cold War. Carrier aviation, perfected in those terrible years, would dominate the seas for the next 80 years. And the analytical methods forged in that Pearl Harbor basement evolved into the vast intelligence networks of the modern age. The NSA's computers, the algorithms of cryptanalysis, the fusion of cultural, linguistic, and mathematical expertise that still defines intelligence work today. In 1985, surviving members of Station Hypo gathered for a reunion. Old men now, gray and stooped, meeting in a quiet hall to remember their youth spent in the furnace of war. They spoke of Rochefort working in his bathrobe because the heat made uniforms unbearable, of the caffeine and benzodrine that kept them awake for days, of the moment the AF is short of water intercept came through, of the 6 minutes that turned the Pacific War. Some wept for comrades who never returned. Others marveled at what they had achieved with nothing but intellect and willpower. For the first time, they could speak openly, and in their stories, one truth resonated above all, that in the dark, airless room beneath Pearl Harbor, where 5-digit code groups flickered under lamplight, a handful of men had changed the course of history, not with bullets, but with brilliance. Picture the scene, a quiet reunion hall in 1985, filled with gray-haired men whose sharp eyes still carried the intensity of their youth. Edwin Layton, then in his 80s, rose to speak. His voice trembled, not from age, but from the weight of memory. He spoke of May 27, 1942, the day Joseph Rochefort stood before Admiral Nimitz at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference and presented the intelligence that would decide the fate of nations. Layton remembered Rochefort's calm conviction, the quiet defiance in his eyes as he staked his career on one unshakable conclusion: this is where and when they will strike. Washington had doubted. Rochefort had not. And because of that certainty, the American carriers were waiting exactly where they needed to be. The Japanese sailed straight into a trap so perfect it seemed orchestrated by fate itself. Layton paused, his voice catching slightly. None of it, he said, would have happened without men like Rochefort, men who refused to believe that a problem could be unsolvable, who worked when reason said stop, who proved that intelligence could change the course of history. When he sat down, another of the surviving cryptanalysts rose. His words, simple yet profound, seemed to speak for them all. We came to this war as mathematicians, linguists, engineers, men who solved puzzles. We left as people who had changed history, not through violence, but through understanding, not through force, but through intelligence. We read the enemy's mind, and in doing so, we saved thousands of American lives. Some of us were recognized, many were not. Rochefort gave his career to do what was right, not what was safe. Dyer worked himself to exhaustion. Every man and woman in that basement gave everything they had, because we knew what failure would mean. His words filled the room, You could almost hear the echoes of those long nights in Pearl Harbor, the scratching of pencils, the rattle of punch cards, the murmured decoding of enemy transmissions. We proved, he continued, that knowledge is power, that understanding your enemy can defeat him as surely as superior weapons, that a handful of determined people can achieve the impossible. The Japanese codes were said to be unbreakable, 30,000 code groups, constantly shifting, impenetrable. But we broke them, not through luck, but through intellect, endurance, and the refusal to quit. We knew that everything depended on success. He looked out over the silent crowd. The Battle of Midway was won by pilots who dove through fire, by mechanics who rebuilt planes under bombardment, by sailors who fought to keep dying ships afloat. But it was made possible by intelligence, by codebreakers who gave Admiral Nimitz the one thing no commander can win without: certainty. He stopped. Then, with quiet reverence, he said, "To the memory of Joseph Rochefort, born May 12, 1900, who died before receiving the recognition he earned on May 30th, 1986. To Thomas Dyer, and to every cryptanalyst who sacrificed sleep, health, and sometimes sanity. To the linguists who translated, the traffic analysts who found patterns in chaos, the radio operators who captured the signals we deciphered. You changed history. You saved lives. You proved that intelligence in both senses of the word, knowledge and wisdom, is the most powerful weapon in war." The room was utterly still. Then, slowly, applause began to swell, gentle at first, then thunderous. These were men who had lived in silence for 40 years, their achievements hidden, their names unknown. Now, at last, the world was beginning to understand. Their story was more than a tale of wartime heroism. It was a testament to the power of the human mind. They had shown that victory does not always belong to the strongest or the most heavily armed, but to those who understand, who think, who refuse to surrender to complexity. "You don't need the most weapons," the cryptanalyst had said. "You need to understand your enemy better than he understands you. You need leaders who trust intelligence even when it challenges expectation. You need teams that function as one, where ego bows before mission." They had done all of that, and in doing so, they had redefined the meaning of warfare itself. 5 or 6 minutes of precision dive bombing destroyed 3 Japanese carriers at Midway. But those minutes were built on 6 months of relentless cryptanalysis, on Rochefort's belief that the Japanese naval code could be read, on Dyer's sleepless dedication, on the combined brilliance of mathematicians, linguists, and analysts who refused to concede defeat, and on Nimitz's courage to trust them. Yes, America won many victories across the Pacific. But the decisive turning point came on June 4th, 1942, when American dive bombers struck the Japanese fleet at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. That was not luck. That was intelligence. That was what happens when knowledge becomes weaponized understanding. The lesson of Midway is timeless. Knowledge is power. Understanding is victory. Intelligence can change the world. As the applause faded, some of the old men wiped tears from their eyes. They had waited 4 decades for this moment to be heard, to be seen. They had spent their youth in secrecy, changing history from the shadows. Now, they were finally recognized not as anonymous code breakers, but as heroes of the mind. Their achievement was eternal. The Battle of Midway had been fought in many places, on the flight decks where pilots braved impossible odds, in the cockpits of dive bombers plunging through tracer fire, in the engine rooms and damage control stations of burning ships. But it had been made possible in a basement at Pearl Harbor, where a small team turned raw data into destiny, transforming the impossible into the inevitable. There, among stacks of intercepts and flickering lamps, 5-digit number groups became keys to Japan's intentions. Exhausted men labored through nights that blurred into days, driven by duty, discipline, and the unyielding will to succeed. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976 in Torrance, California, at the age of 76, before the full story could be told. But his legacy endures. In the intelligence community he shaped, in the methods he created, and in the truth he proved that understanding your enemy can be the most powerful weapon of all. He was the code breaker who read Japanese minds, the officer in the bathrobe who won the Pacific War from a basement, the mathematician who proved that knowledge truly is power. That was Joseph Rochefort. That was Station Hypo. And that was how America learned to read every Japanese message, and in doing so, learned how to win a war that once seemed unwinnable. The story of JN-25 and the codebreakers who conquered it remains one of the greatest triumphs of intellect in human history, proof that wars are not won only by might, but by mind, not only by weapons, but by wisdom, and that a handful of people armed with determination and brilliance can indeed change the course of the world. Exactly. June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway was the dramatic, visible turning point, but it was built on months of unseen, meticulous work in a basement in Hawaii. Those cryptanalysts transformed seemingly indecipherable numbers into actionable intelligence. They showed that the mind could match and even surpass brute force. They didn't just break codes, they broke the assumptions of war itself, that only ships, guns, and bombs decide outcomes. Their success proved that analysis, insight, and collaboration can shape events just as decisively as fleets of aircraft carriers. They were mathematicians, linguists, radio operators, traffic analysts, and officers. Each contributed a vital piece of the puzzle. Each hour of their labor added clarity to a fog of uncertainty that could have cost thousands of lives. The code breakers of Station Hypo were the hidden force that made Midway a victory. They were proof that knowledge is the ultimate weapon, and that understanding your enemy is the first indispensable step to defeating him. In a way, they were the real architects of victory, the quiet minds behind a loud, historic triumph. If you want, I can craft a succinct, powerful tribute paragraph that captures the essence of Station Hypo's achievement in a few sentences. It could read like an epilogue or dedication. Would you like me to do that?